team is going to review your chair. Please state your name, the speaking position you prefer. I'm just going to confirm that we're debating the motion that we prefer a world where political entities subscribe solely to moralism rather than realism. I'd now like to welcome the first affirmative speaker to open this debate. Here. Affirmative speaker, I'll welcome the first negative speaker to open their case. Here.
Is like the recording good to go? Is it on? Okay, cut that out. Three things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why we get better government and political institutions. And thirdly, on why realism is better for voters. Okay, on setup. Firstly, just note really importantly, there is no moral framework. I'll say that objectively. And like, I don't know, I'll quote, I can't even remember who it was. Like the is-ought conundrum, right? You cannot create an ought statement from a collection of is statements. It means there is no one objective moral truth. I think that's obviously identified the point in which opposition was talking about consequentialism and deontological beliefs. Obviously, you can't just like weigh them up. So there is no correct moral framework. Really important to establish that. Okay, firstly, secondly actually, what does our support in this debate? I think probably they want to talk a lot about consequentialism and utilitarianism. I think it's unlikely that parties are going to become that simplistic as political entities. I think much more importantly, they're going to adopt some monolithic moral / pseudo political philosophy on some, probably existing on some spectrum from individualism to collectivism. And I think they will themselves treat it as subjective and unshakable. What do we support in our side? Firstly, that political parties consider individuals as moral deciding units and hence should propose policy that like the individuals decide is good. And that's just because like they want votes. Secondly though, is that politicians are only exist as representatives of these people, not some truth-saying Jesus who actually knows like the one true way to fix Australia. Okay, on to the first point on why we get better governments and political institutions. Firstly, just why moral philosophy is incredibly harmful. Note, like at the point at which it's not objective, it is not created in a vacuum. I think this is really important when you consider who is creating these moral frameworks. It's obviously going to be like politicians. Probably you're quite privileged at the point you're able to like give up everything to like campaign for a couple of years to potentially become a politician in the first place. Probably have connections to get elected in the first place. And note, people do not create people create self-serving moral philosophies. I think this looks like, I don't know why I'm saying this, but how people defend the US Constitution when in reality, a lot of it was just based on Lockean philosophy who just wanted to justify slavery. Okay, but fourthly, note that societies change and evolve over time. The best way to capture this is through like trying to get like the votes from the people. I think at the end of this point, note really importantly that at the point at which Zoe's entire case was contingent on like perhaps there are some morally good things which aren't popular, like reparations, like welfare, like benefiting other actors. Consider that probably the Liberal Party is like at the point at which they probably adopt some like pseudo-Thatcherite philosophy. It's actually much easier to just cut out welfare. Obviously, welfare is good because people don't die, but if it's much easier to like justify in a vacuum, well, you should only like get money if you do work like the rest of us. Hence, like you just should be giving out money for free. Really bad because you don't get any of these harms to minorities opposition wanted to talk about. And I think that's just because it's much easier to trust the average person's philosophy than it is these like elite politicians' philosophy. Okay, why is moral philosophy bad for government? I think firstly, bad policy design. Note, they will always preference some framework rather than the will of the people. That's just because they think they are like right. But note, on the contrary, realism will always acknowledge ideological differences that people may have, but will preference like what the individuals want. I think this is really important because no political party obviously represents everyone at the point at which they obviously differ on issues. But a government needs to represent everyone. A government needs to make policy that benefits the general consensus. I think that's much better when you are going to be a political party that actually cares about the majority of people rather than like your own little political philosophy. Probably not that little. Secondly, it's just much harder to self-criticize within the party and criticize your moral philosophy. I think it looks like how hard it is to like criticize the US Constitution, where things about gun rights have completely shifted from a duty to a right. And I think it just blocks out a lot of criticism. I think firstly, it's just anti-democratic at the point at which you like are anyway. Secondly, I think you're just less likely to accept criticism. Note the point at which you get Thatcherite governments introducing a poll tax. Obviously, a really stupid policy in reality, because obviously people can't pay the same amount of tax. But was almost introduced because Thatcher was so convinced in her political philosophy. I think obviously this is a world which side opposition really has to contend with at the point you have lots of conservative parties who are often in power, whereas we obviously are probably going much likely to get more pragmatic policy, which isn't as so insane as a poll tax. Okay, why is secondly in this point, maybe it's thirdly, why policy implementation is going to be bad. Note firstly, we just think policy will be implemented poorly. Why is this? I think the reason policy is going to be implemented poorly is because politics doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? You are making changes to a society. A society cannot be represented in an essay. I think that's why you need to step outside of the world of your political philosophy to implement things. I think, for example, it's making much more nuanced ideas on. It's like creating more nuanced policy than perhaps your ideological preference goes to. But secondly, also, I think it's perhaps accepting maybe you aren't able to implement a policy to the extent you want to implement, but it's probably still good to implement a shorter version of that. Secondly, I think it justifies political discrimination. I think when you are a self-righteous political party, you probably become of the mindset that all those people who are so stupid enough to oppose you, right, because they obviously just don't see your objective moral truth, don't deserve the benefits you are taking up the mantle to pursue. I think that's how you actually lock out lots of minority groups into discussion, lots of different actors into policy discussions when governments do come into power. But thirdly, I just think policy becomes a lot less efficient. Why is this? Firstly, in a lot of major democracies, coalitions are needed. That means you have to be able, I can't remember the word, but each side goes halfway, etc. I don't know what you said, but anyway, sure it was that. That's the point. That is something which a lot of parties have to do, especially within France and Italy, where they can be 3 or 4 parties, right? Compromise. So I think it's really hard. You probably get a lot less compromise under side opposition when obviously they obviously think every other party is wrong. I think it's much better under our side when you are able to understand. Perhaps people who live out west may have a different perspective on life than someone who lives in an urban area. Maybe it's the Liberals, I hate the Liberals, but maybe you can come to terms to actually govern, right, with the Nationals, instead of just shitting on everything the Nationals want to do, and the Nationals shitting on everything you want to do, and just never having a government. Obviously, you also just need cooperation in hung parliaments at the point at which there isn't any. That's bad because policy doesn't get passed quickly. Then on why realism is better for voters. Firstly, on framing voters most important, blah blah blah. Why it's more rapid. First, we center them as central to governments. I think we center the individuals having moral obligations to choose which policy is better. I think note that just means people are more likely to turn out at the point in which they can be a moral obligation to decide what's right. Not always compulsory voting. We get more voting. We also get protesting, right? Because when they feel that the government isn't serving their interest and the government is failing them, they're going to protest. Whereas obviously, if your party didn't get elected, you're probably okay, maybe I'll win next election, right? Finally, my voters will include. Firstly, we think that governments will serve the people versus serve their morality, obviously feel included. Secondly, it's just like policy and election promises are going to be less direct and abstract under side opposition. I think that people just don't understand a lot of political philosophy. And thirdly, is that ideological driven promises are exclusionary because we don't understand philosophy. So proud to oppose.
I think this claim from side opposition that most moralism isn't objective is firstly unsubstantiated as a whole, but secondly just untrue. Because obviously there are basic ideas and concepts fundamental to humanity that people do view morally objective no matter what side of the political sphere you are. And claim that the LNP do not have this to some extent for people, such as the basic rights set out in the UN and things like that, is just clearly untrue. But also we think that people generally believe this idea of to some extent believe this idea of moral objectiveness. And what that means then is that obviously politicians don't have to stray that far from what their constituents want all the time. It's just on direct issues that impact them. What does that look like? Maybe if you have a very, very white and rich seat that you sit in Australia, it means you still vote on things like welfare and increasing payments when inflation increases. Those are the kinds of things that politicians would still stick up for in our world because they are morally good and they serve for the greater people rather than just for their constituents and people who put them in power like they tell you. Because obviously obviously those very people and the minority oftentimes do not put you in power because they contain less of the votes. Okay, a couple of issues then in this debate. Firstly, recapitalisation. Secondly, on who actually gets better government. And thirdly, what is better for all, what is actually better for these people, I guess voters. It's the same kind of things that, same kind of things to say. Firstly, recapitalisation. The opposition claim that there is no moral truth, and the way they do this is to say that different political parties have different ideas of things at different times. For example, they say things like, they try about these claims because they have different views on things, it doesn't mean there is a set of moral truths that exist in society. I think the first kind of thing is it's easy to intuition push them. I've already said the UN Convention and the things that the greater society of pretty much all 190 states in that agree to. That is a set of moral truths that exists. That is a set of moral truths that exists. And whilst it might not be popular, whilst it might not occur in the most utilitarian response that actually results in the best outcomes, it is things that we are supposed to follow because they are just good. And that is what they're taking away. So for example, it is things like if there is someone dying, you should probably help them out, even if it costs you more money to do so, and even if they can't pay for it themselves. And obviously then I think it is true that on the whole, people do agree with this, but sometimes they differ, and that is what we are talking about in this debate. When politicians can stand up and make these claims and say, although it may not lead to the best utilitarian outcome, it is just good for society. And that is why we think that individuals aren't all the time, and especially voters, the best at making these decisions. Because oftentimes they put their interests ahead of their own. Some way in that is obviously that minorities, especially as we tell you at first, have oftentimes come under the least support from governments, but oftentimes the most atrocities committed against them. So even though as a majority, for example, do have the most voting power and therefore do enter into the social contract, and as we tell you at first, they do pay the most tax, and therefore presumably on their side, they have entered this social contract to a further extent. What that means is the politicians in their head now, on the opposition side, should serve them more fundamentally because of that. And obviously, that is just not fair. And if you look at it from any perspective from society, it is probably a good idea to support the very people that have undergone the worst lives because of decisions made in the past. And if you want to support that from side opposition, I'm sure you can do so. Secondly then, on better government. And I think that firstly, a couple of ideas as to why moral frameworks can't be objective, I think they give, is that firstly, they change and evolve over time. And that may be true, but that doesn't prove why moral objective, or why moral objective doesn't exist. It just proves that it changes over time. So obviously then politicians can therefore change their objectives over time as well. The second thing they go to say is that is that for some reason that when you are going out, they make this kind of point that the people deciding what is morally objective are people such as white and rich and people that can be in these politically can be in positions themselves. But as we've already intuition pushed on you at first and second, there are just some things that all politicians tend to support because firstly, the majority of people actually believe in them, but secondly also, it just ultimately maybe secondly, I know people all the time support them, but even when they don't, it is probably fair in most cases for politicians to be able to make these kinds of decisions. And say to people, for example, you know what, I know it would cost us more to do this thing, and maybe on a utilitarian basis, they don't live in our constituency, but we're going to give these people a right to immigrate into our country. And politicians make decisions all the time. So it is so unclear from their side as to why the majority now doesn't support these kinds of ideas. And if they want to point to little segments of society and point to the far right and things like those, maybe we can say that, but that exists on both sides, right? So I don't think that is rather good. They also use this idea of the US Constitution a lot, saying that these kinds of people therefore view this as a right and not just a set of ideals. I don't really understand how that plays in this debate either due to the sense that oftentimes the way they further support things like the gun laws in the US is because politicians take bad donations from the NRA and other parties because they take it as a utilitarian gain. Because they say to themselves, if I can get more money, what that means is I can put that money into my constituency and serve people more. But obviously there are bad outcomes that come to that. So while on a utilitarian basis, I might be able to put that money into things like supporting my constituency, what that means is I oftentimes have to cede on really morally objective ideas, such as the fact that maybe people in classrooms shouldn't be able to walk around and have guns and shoot other people. But if anything, what that proves to you is that's just fine. I also just think that people are bad at predicting the future, especially politicians. I'm running out of time. So that's why they take donations and think they can do something further. I also think people are less efficient than they tell you, because as they say, coalitions are needed. But if moral objectives obviously are a set of laws that, as we tell you and prove to you, are similar across all people, what that actually means then is policy is closer together than ever. Coalitions are easier to form and policy is easier to make because these set of moral guidelines exist most of the time. Secondly, they know why it's better for all people. And I think it's quite easy in this debate for us to outweigh them. Because guess what? The minorities that have been oppressed over years and years and years and years will continue to do so if you let utilitarianism prevail. Because there will continue to be, in Australia, white voters voting for things against the voice, against reparations for Indigenous people. And if that's something they want to support in this debate, I wave my hat to them because they can do a great job at that if they really want to. But I think it is incredibly hard. Because obviously it is true that these people deserve, in any morally objective sense, some kind of moral reparations for the stolen generation, for their stolen land over years and years and years at some point in time. But because we believe in this idea that we need the greatest good for the greatest people, and now myself, if I sit in an example in an inner Sydney seat, and all my constituents are having to be white and rich, I therefore don't vote on things like Aboriginal Voice Department, or Indigenous Voice Department, and Indigenous rights, because they weren't my constituents and weren't the people that gave me power. That means that you ultimately result in these people, the ones that needed it most over time, not dying, getting less support than ever. Proud to propose.
Affirmative team is that they choose to assume that there is some generally agreed upon objective moral framework, despite the fact that every piece of political evidence that we can look at shows otherwise. The Democrats believe that bodily autonomy is essential to the human, and yet Republicans, states across the country of America are repealing those rights. States, like Australia, respect gay marriage as being important, and yet Greece only very recently accepted that gay people's love was valuable enough to grant marriage. It is not true that there is some kind of objective and always agreed upon morality, and it is this assumption that loses sight of this debate. The first question I'm going to ask is, do we get better political entities? And then I'm going to talk about why we get better voters. Let's begin with political entities, because we begin at Matthew by explaining a set of reasons why political realism is necessary for the functioning of governments. That is, now they are forced to be flexible and consider the will of the people, even if it contradicts their ideology. They are forced to represent all people, not just those who voted for them and share their ideologies, and also that they are just forced to cooperate within the legislature. How does this affirmative team respond? They make, I think, 5 claims. The first is that now governments lose the ability to help vulnerable people when they are in the minority. And this is just kind of an expansion of the idea that utilitarianism is bad. My obvious response to this is that that is indeed our argument, that the adoption of utilitarianism as an objective moral truth is indeed harmful. Our argument is that First Nations people participate in democracy and that their representatives should fight for them, even if it clashes with the ideology. Compare that to side affirmative, where all ideologies will tend towards majoritarianism, for the reason that obviously political parties have the incentive to be as majoritarianism as possible, because they want to collect as many votes as possible. So it is under their side that the minority of people and the most vulnerable are fucked over, because it is never advantageous for you as a political party to pitch yourselves specifically to First Nations people, or to pitch yourselves specifically to the poorest in your communities. And so if you do not think about them and your ideology, you will never fight for them. But if it is true that there are dominant ideologies which are pro-welfare or which do care about Indigenous people, then we co-opt those benefits, because it indicates that there are people within that society who hold the belief that reparations or welfare is important, in which case it is the obligation of the government to pursue those policies, because that is what the individuals themselves want. So, side affirmative must stand for a world where the poor are always screwed over, or if there are ideologies which are good for them, we can co-opt those benefits but do it far, far better. Secondly, they claim governments justify doing bad things because there is no objective morality. Just consider the persuasiveness of this argument. It is insane. Imagine a politician getting up and saying, yeah, sorry about that, but it's okay because there's no objective morality. Do you think that would work? The obvious intuition is no, because people are not fucking stupid. But secondly, I'm going to flip this, because I think Thatcher and other powerful political leaders were able to do things like say, I'm just feeding you the medicine, it's okay if you don't like it because it's in your best, it's in like the ideology's best interest. It is under their side that politicians and governments are able to justify their incredibly pernicious and destructive behaviors by literally using the rhetoric of this ideology is objectively good and you should buy into it, even if you are suffering, even if you on the ground think it's doing more harm than good. Their third claim is, I think, a bit more persuasive, and that's that governments become more collaborative because they agree on moral frameworks. And the question I have is, do parties agree on what is good? The obvious intuition is no. So I'm going to flip this claim, because under their side, political parties are never likely to cooperate because they disagree on what the objective ideology should be, which means that in contexts where there is no clear majority, their governments do absolutely nothing because there is no incentive to create policy, because you feel as though the objective morality would be stifled and ruined if you were to adapt, if you were to concede anything important. So, under our world, it is far, far preferable because political parties may hold different beliefs, but they consider people as individual moral units as the most essential part of democracy, which means they continue to fight for policy which is good for their constituents, even at a time when you disagree on necessarily what the best kind of ideology or moral theory should be. Their fourth claim is that this breaks social contract theory because you don't create policy for prisoners or asylum seekers anymore. My first response is that obviously individuals still have human empathy, people still care about these people's rights. And you should believe that intuition because time and time again, people are willing to donate huge amounts of money to these charities. People are willing to donate huge amounts of time, and people are willing to lobby their governments to do things which are beneficial for people who are completely disconnected and different from them. And that's because there is just kind of an idea that individuals have empathy towards one another. And the reason that's important, because that might seem kind of static or kind of unstrategic as an observation, but it's not. Because if people care about others and have empathy towards others, then they will lobby their specific leaders and their specific representatives to do things which are in those people's interests. If people don't care at all, then dominant ideologies won't be good for them. Secondly though, I'm going to flip this argument. I think it is way easier to exclude prisoners or asylum seekers under side affirmative for the reason that they can say they don't subscribe to our ideal of political moralism. For example, imagine how easy it would be for Republicans to paint immigrants or illegal immigrants as like stains on their kind of political ideology. I think under their side, they're able to weaponize it to make sure that the vulnerable never access any of their rights. Their fifth claim, and I think their final claim, is that this gives power to corporations because they give lots of money and are therefore important as moral actors, which has a massive logical jump that they never prove, because people and individuals are obviously not corporations. And the question I would ask you is, do you right now think companies have moral value? Maybe some absolute trash finance bros think that companies do have moral value, but you shouldn't. You should consider that individuals are different, which means the worst harms under side affirmative are symmetrical. And that's because things like lobbying, things like corporate capture, are connected to an individual politician's greed, an individual politician's want for money, which is obviously unchanged about whether or not they care about political realism. It is something which goes to the very heart of their identity, which means under their side, they still have to cop the very, very worst of abuses. But under our side, things are far more likely to benefit, the individual and harm corporate capture, for the reason that perhaps your ideology says that libertarianism or free markets are good, and so you want to do things like make sure that companies have free reign. But under our side, you only care about the individual, and so you trump their rights when it is most important. So, why do we win this issue? Two reasons. Firstly, because political parties are now far more flexible, which means they are able to collaborate with different politicians and different parties. They are able to pass policy even if they do not have a majority. But they're able to pass policy which benefits everyone in society, not just those who subscribe to their different political opinions or to subscribe to their overarching political belief. But secondly, we create more representative political entities because the people in power know that what matters is what the individual wants and not what the old white guy in the 1800s wrote down in a book and then published. Be real. So, Wayne, two things to consider. Firstly, the scale and power of these political entities is massive. If we can change their behavior in beneficial ways, that is hugely important. But secondly, consider the vulnerability of those who are screwed over when political entities do bad things. States have a monopolization on violence, states have a monopolization on power and everything within a state. Making sure that they are using that power well is obviously the most important. Second question, do we get better voters? And the framing I want to contribute is that we can still win this debate, even if we lose the first issue. And the reason for that is that voters are prior to every other democratic outcome. So in order for democratic institutions to flourish, you need voters to be good. At MAP, we explain why political realism is important and powerful for voters. It has not yet been responded to. Firstly, voters are more likely to feel enfranchised, which means that when they believe that they are central to the democratic unit, they are more likely to vote. And obviously that's essential when most places don't have mandatory or compulsory voting. So you want individuals to feel like they need to do something. They have some kind of moral obligation in order to be successful democratic citizens. But secondly, political parties are far more likely to engage with them. And that's because they feel the imperative to understand what people want, which means they're more likely to go into communities and understand what they want and what needs they have. Secondly though, individuals are more likely to support protests when governments are being abusive. And the reason for that is the whole shtick of we're just doing what's in your best interest no longer flies. If you feel that you're being harmed, if you feel that your community is being screwed over, you are not going to accept that. And that means the most vulnerable, the most screwed over, the most marginalized have a fighting chance. You must oppose this policy.
I'm just so incredibly confused as to what this negative team actually stands for, right? Because they tell us that they don't stand for things like utilitarianism, they tell us that they also stand up for the little guy, but they also tell us that the politicians necessarily should represent the majority, necessarily should represent the most number of people, so I'm completely unsure what they actually stand for and how they get any of the outcomes that they talk about. One thing I want to deal with at the start of this speech, and that is what specifically they stand for. Their main claim here is to say that morality is not objective. I think the key thing to note here is I actually think it is pretty objective. I think we give you a multitude of different examples at first to tell you why it is objective, to tell you why vulnerable people do deserve to be protected in the vast majority of circumstances. I think the meager examples that they do bring up at the start are perhaps historical or otherwise updated examples that do not apply to the vast majority of cases that we are talking about. Okay, so I'm going to go through the rest of this speech under the presumption that they necessarily do have to advocate for things like utilitarianism if they do want to represent the majority. I think the other thing to then note as well is I think the key thing to note here, and the reason why they do not get all of the policies and all of the advantages that we tell you at first, is because as a politician, you are not going to be voted in if you do represent the interests of the minority under their side. The reason why is because under a world where you now only vote for a person that you believe is going to best fulfill your own interests and do the specific policies that you believe about, I do not think that now you value any sort of minority policy whatsoever. And the reason why is the rhetoric that a lot of right-wing parties use, that is to say policies that advantage minority groups are obviously policies that directly come out of your pocket or come at the loss of policies for yourself. I think what this means is that the opposition necessarily needs to support majoritarian policies. So, 3 things in this speech. First off, a further characterization of like what does this specifically look like and what does that like, who creates its morality. Secondly, then on governments and parties, and finally on voters and who gets better outcomes for them. So, first off, just briefly at the start of this, in terms of the main thing that we hear from the opposition on what this morality looks like is that privileged people make it and that it's like really old examples, so on and so forth. Obviously, incredibly uncharitable. I think the key thing to note here is that politicians on both sides probably come from the same demographics. Perhaps on our side, we actually get more inflamed politicians that actually come from minority groups because they understand that morality is more important, that there are certain interests that should be sacrificed for the more vulnerable group. But I think the other thing to note as well is since they come from the same demographic and since they perform the same essential functions, I think they are likely to still try to do things like appeal to the public in order to get voted in. And I think what this means is that they will still decide an appropriate morality that befits the public of that particular time. So I think on our side, we still get a relatively reasonable set of politicians. Secondly, then, on governments and parties. The first thing I want to examine here is who actually gets elected. The main claim that we hear at first, neg, is to suggest that yet they instead get people elected who are going to focus on serving the public instead of serving like truth-saying Jesuses. I think the key thing to note here is I think this is actually quite bad to over-prioritize policy platforms over the particular ideals of a party. That is to say, I think a lot of policy platforms are not very unique across particular individuals. I think they're oftentimes that of a party instead of that of a specific individual. But I think the other thing to note as well is that there are a lot of unexpected situations that arise as a politician. That, for example, looks like the fact that global conditions change incredibly rapidly. The economy goes up and down in the blink of an eye, or otherwise you're just faced with a range of different conundrums, like having to make deals with parties and stuff like that. I think in those sorts of situations, your policy platform does not say very much as to what you are specifically going to do. So I think it is far better instead to advocate for someone and vote in someone who you know it has a particular set of morals, like they don't believe in things like corruption, they don't believe in taking lobbying like money from like massive oil and gas companies. And I think that is far better and that ensures better political outcomes. The other thing to note as well is in terms of this idea of the people they serve, so on and so forth, I think we tell you at first sufficient reasons why the people that they specifically serve are likely to be incredibly privileged, and I think this is the thing that hasn't gotten any response to from the negative team, which is to say that the social contract theory necessarily suggests that the amount that you give up in order for state protections is how much you necessarily deserve, and what this means then is that privileged people or rich people, or especially rich governments, if they contribute a lot to the state, then that is how much protection that they do deserve, that is how much power that they do deserve within this. Okay, then on forming coalitions, we tell you that it is far easier to form coalitions on our side because objective morality necessarily is unifying. You're far more likely to work with different parties, even if you come from different backgrounds, because you believe that you're working towards the same objective, even if you in the past have believed and have disagreed on what particular routes to pursue in order to reach it. The main response that we hear from second is that parties disagree on what objective morality is. I'm kind of unsure then how any of their rebuttal against us stands up at all. Obviously then we perhaps have a very diverse set of morals that I think are going to work quite well. And then I think that ultimately that response doesn't quite work here. Okay, the next response that we hear to the idea that politicians get away with more things because they're able to excuse a lot of things because they're able to say that they're serving a particular policy aim instead of an objective set of morality, is to say that Thatcher now gets to say that morality is objective and try and excuse all of her behaviours in that sort of way. I think the key thing to note here is obviously the ordinary intelligent voter is the same level, or like voters in general are the same level of like intelligence on both sides of this debate. So I think what this means is that you're unlikely to allow people to get away with using this excuse when obviously that morality does not apply. That is to say, I do not think Thatcher has particular moralities that like say, oh, war crimes are really cool and we love war crimes and we should allow war crimes to happen. I don't think any politician would be voted in if they did that particular thing. I think what is instead far more likely is if you believe that you as an individual have the capacity to use this thing for a particular good aim, then you're likely to believe that you're able to do that particular thing and you're likely to break some sorts of moral codes. This is the whole your good ends justify bad means sort of thing. Whereas I do not think that is something that is true, especially for politicians, and there are certain codes of conduct that do need to be met from this group. So, finally then on voters. Main thing that we hear from the negative team is that they do feel a lot more centralized, and they do feel as though they are prioritized. I think the key thing to note here again is that this is only a certain number of people, and these are the most enfranchised people that are the most numerous within the group, that have the most power, and that feel as though they are paying the most taxes, so they deserve the most out of the group. I think the other thing to note, so that's the only person that is cared about, but I think the other thing to note here as well is what that means is that the vulnerable groups of people that we talk about, that are spread out across different identities, but are quite numerous in number once you add them up, are the ones that are necessarily disprivileged. One piece of weighing here, obviously these are the most vulnerable groups of people that do need to be represented, but are highly unlikely to be represented in any other sort of situation, because they do need things like unique policies that come out of the pockets of the government in order to benefit them. The other response that we hear as well is the other sort of construction that we hear at second as well is that they do things now like going into the community, so on and so forth. Obviously they still do that on our side. I think this idea of objective morality still exists on our side. However, now in order to act upon it, you need to figure out what this group of people needs the most. Your objective morality is probably not like this particular policy aim is the best, but instead that you need to help this particular group of people because they have been disprivileged in the past, and thus you will go out into that community to figure out how best to do it. Okay. Then onto refugees. The main response that we hear here is that individuals generally have empathy for each other and thus will still try and protect each other in certain ways. Obviously, if that was true, then we wouldn't be in the state of the world that we are in right now. But I think this also and the reason why I think is because for the vast majority of voters, this sort of voting for these sorts of parties or voting on these sorts of policies necessarily comes at a trade-off for your own comfort and your own rights as well. That is to say, if the government suddenly decides to do reparations for a group of people, that is directly, tangibly affects your life in terms of an increase in the taxes that you have to pay. Obviously, then you're likely to prioritize your own rights within that situation. You're likely to focus on that sort of thing, and your politicians that represent your particular group are likely to oppose any sort of policy that will help any vulnerable group of people. Ultimately, because all of the things that we tell you at first will stand, so far to propose.
Panel, audience, friends, what is good? The affirmative team could not tell you today. I cannot tell you today, because no one can tell you today what is objectively good in the world, in our thoughts, or in our practices of how we implement those thoughts. But this affirmative team wants to claim that in every circumstance, in every country, in every party, in every moral, religious, or democratic value set, there is a single objective truth. But the reality is that it does not exist, and even if it did exist, that parties cannot all subscribe to it, or cannot all agree on the way to subscribe to it, and that is why their case falls. Let us look at the first question of why there is no good. And I would note here that affirmative's case splits as the debate goes on, become broader and broader. From at first a very specific set of visions of what is good for policy, to this very broad stuff about the UNHDR at second, to this broad idea of life is good at third, we should preserve that. The problems here are things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights was not universally agreed to as applied in the name of the document. People like the USA pulled out of that because it did not occur with their conception of what moral values was. So in its first test, you can see that some countries and some parties don't agree to what they think are the most basic set of human rights. But secondly, this is so broad panel that it cannot stand today's debate as a reasonable justification for their side. Because how do we actually protect those rights? Do we go tough on crime and lock up Indigenous kids in Alice Springs for decades to protect one individual's right to safety, which is like a UN Declaration of the rights, like safety and education? Or do we give more welfare? That takes away tax money and other people's rights to enjoy their right to education, or it takes away state budgets to provide free healthcare. So their thing falls at the question of how the implementation works of those values, and that is why you cannot necessarily they're set up there. So what do we do then? Well, we cannot find a universal agreed to set of values or a way to implement those values that is universally morally just. We must fall back upon the people, because that is where we derive our power as political institutions. It is derived from our citizens. It is zero-sum. We give up our rights to collect our own tax. We give up our rights to self-defense to allow the state and other bodies to act in our place and to implement those policies for us. So in the absence of a singular, known, and fully agreed upon conception of morality and the implementation of that morality, we do not know what to do, and we should therefore divert to the people, who are the ones that are the actual reason that we give us justification to lead, and that, my friends, is political realism. Their response to this at two ends are to say the issue with realism, so the issue of realism is that those who pay more ought to deserve more as a consequence. The thing I'd note here is there's one vote, one person is the metric by which we do this. So all of these, so all people are equal in this conception here. Obviously they talk about donations here, and that's not preferable. We're not saying these systems are perfect, but you can also buy morals. Like Julie Bishop's morals were bought when she defended James Hardy after he murdered people with asbestosis. Gladys Berejiklian's morals were stolen when her boyfriend in Wagga Wagga wanted a new shot put facility, right? Like their morals and virtues are as viable as legal realism as well. That is unfortunately the reality of politics. But what we think politicians should strive for is one which they think about the people, because the people are the ones they are robbing when they engage in acts of corruption and engage in acts to prioritise donors and money and romance over people individually. But the second thing I know here on tax, yes, we tax people differently, and that is not the metric though. The metric is we all give up equal communal rights, like our right to self-defence, for example, to have a justice system or a police system, and to allow the state to operate with a monopoly of power. So yes, we're taxed differently, but we all give up those equal rights. The next critique they make the second opponent is to critique utilitarianism. I mean, that doesn't work because they can't guarantee the moral virtue that their party thinks is correct is utilitarianism, because then all their harms just affect them if their party thinks utilitarianism is the objective good. So that falls into today's debate. And as I said, even if all this is true, we can't guarantee parties buy into it, we can't guarantee parties act the same way. They then make a rogue last-minute claim that third after they get more minority politicians, utterly unproven, should be given no credit in today's debate. Let's then secondly look at how parties act. Because what do we want to be at the forefront of parties' minds when they're making decisions about policy or response to crisis or campaign slogans? Because this is where the debate happens, right? The debate happens when parties and politicians make decisions. Do we want at the forefront of their mind to be a conception of morality from their perspective, one that is bought from their visions of their life experiences, privileged people, one that is bought from the writings of Locke 200 years ago when he tried to justify slavery? Do we want that belief to come from old moral actors, or the belief rather that they themselves are perfect moral actors acting for ultimate good? Or do we want the forefront of the decision-making process to be citizens? Do we want it to be how do we give back to them because they have given to us by allowing us to lead and allowing us to act? The positioning of a sole focus on realism and reciprocal nature of the political relationship at the forefront of every decision making is how we all want parties to act, and we want them to think they need the approval of the citizenry before they act on the citizenry going forward. They tell us, let's do some responses then. They first tell us it's easier to reach coalitions and form agreements on their side. The first thing I note here is if you have more than one conception of morality, or more than one conception of how to exercise that morality, you cannot form a coalition on their side because they believe they are morally virtuous, they believe they are morally justified, and they are inflexible in that moral justification because they do not think they have an obligation to get shit done for the people, because the morals is how they get stuff done for people on their side. And that means that then you don't actually get that level of agreement that they want. So their side locks in stances and can't move. And that is important because it is the only mechanism they have on path to resolving political deadlocks is when people can form an agreement on the objective morality. Like, I'm sure everyone in politics wants to have the objective morality of kids going to school and getting education, but something we should find Indigenous parents when the kids don't go to school doesn't work for them, and something we should change the way schools work. Both of those are trying to achieve the same UN Declaration of Human Rights outcome there, but they have wildly different moral approaches to achieving it. They can't get coalitions on their side. Let's compare that to realism then. We are here to serve people, so they opt to support policy that is likely to achieve support those people and achieve good outcomes and cross-nexus compromise. And that is the best outcome. I'll come to why I'm running out of time a lot. All right, let's talk about how parties act with regards to policy now. I think they give a whole bunch of examples in the debate about prisons, which have already been flipped, about welfare, which is already depends on your morals, and about the voice we hear at the end there. But that just depends on the moral stance of whether or not you think reparations are real, because whether or not you think you're responsible, or whether you think those that were alive 200 years ago are the ones responsible. So they can't claim on that side and it fits them nowhere. They tell us you can justify anything with realism. That is also true if your morality fits a certain way. You can justify most things with morality too. They can't just rely on that. They then tell us you'll serve about serving non-citizens such as refugees. But we would serve refugees on our side if the individual will of citizens allowed it, such as it does in states like New York, or cities like New York, I guess, where people do support refugees in that sense. And politicians do make stances that advocate for the rights of refugees and do representations of parties like the Greens and other left-wing parties. So it can be possible to achieve those outcomes for refugees if citizenry is supported here. They then said thirdly that when things rapidly change, crises occur, and it's really bad when you've got on our side. But they're actually the one that are bad there now, right? Because They are, like, obviously parties are still going to act on a political realism side with some broad set of agreeable policies, some degree of ideology, etc. Because that is literally how parties work, with a broad sense of agreed policy ideology. But the difference is the way in which that is created and decisions they make are based on realism. I mean, give some incredibly good examples where that realism has been very successful. JobKeeper and JobSeeker are the most un-Tory policies ever implemented in this country because it was massive amounts of welfare for literally doing nothing. But they did it because it was the thing that served the citizens at the time. It dealt with political realism. If we operate in a world that was purely moral, we operated purely with this vision of like libertarian morality, we don't know what we did in the UK and the USA when no one got welfare and people died as a consequence. And we don't think that is good. Lastly, on voices, we tell you that a bunch of stuff at first doesn't get responded to, checking notes is really good. At the end of this speech, be real, give it to political realism.